What does prolapse and camping have in common, or camping have in common? I often use this analogy for to put pelvic organ prolapse into a understandable concept to people that have maybe only heard of it for the first time once they saw their gynecologist or urologist. And it could be terrifying when you don't know what it is. So I like to use this analogy of it of a tent to describe what prolapse is. My name is Dr. Jocelyn Conley. I'm a pelvic floor physical therapist, founder of the Vagina Doc, and in this video, we're going to talk prolapse. So I want you to visualize, hopefully you've been in a tent before. I want you to visualize what laying in a tent, and the tent is closed. And imagine this tent that you're in has a front door and has a back door, and then has a roof that's kind of just a typical roof, nothing special. And then you have the sidewalls. Now imagine if someone fell into the front of your tent where the front door is. In pelvic organ prolapse or vaginal wall descent problems, you might hear those two different terms. What someone falling into the front door of the tent would be equivalent to is if the bladder was falling into, and I hate using the word falling, but putting pressure on the front wall of the vaginal canal. So the canal, the tube is like a cylindrical tube, and it's made up of smooth muscles that can change sizes depending on the state of the body. And we have ligaments that serve as our anchors that hold, and ligaments is a loose term. It's connective tissue that hold the pelvic organs onto the pelvic wall, kind of like a boat is held to anchors if it's anchored in water. Now, like I said, the bladder putting pressure on the front of the vaginal wall is kind of similar to someone falling or something falling into the front door of your tent. The bladder isn't in your vagina, and that thing is not in your tent, but they're taking up space. Now, if it were the back door of your tent, it's like the rectum putting pressure into the back vaginal wall. And let's say if it's the top, that is the cervix and or uterus putting pressure onto what is called the apex of the vaginal wall. And sometimes it's not uncommon if you have a significant, I guess, stretch or impairment into the system, the suspensory system that holds the organs up, that when the bladder or the cervix and uterus are putting pressure on the vaginal wall, both come. So again, it's not in your tent, or those organs aren't in your tent, but they're in your space. So what happens in that case? Well, why does that happen? And that could be a multiple different things, and that's beyond this video. However, a couple things are, as I mentioned, there's an issue with the connective tissue, and that can happen for different reasons. It could be a genetic thing. It could be related to something that happened during delivery. It could be related to weight, chronic diseases like smoking, chronic obstructive lung disease, or asthma that results in like chronic coughing and straining. Or it could be because, so for someone like me, I've never had any injury. I have never had any connective tissue problems, knocking on wood. But I had issues with some of the prolapse symptoms and vaginal wall descent, and I'm healthy, I'm active. And the reason that happened was because I had nowhere for my organs to go. And my typical strategy for bracing in the gym and talking and just my postural habits, I was always contracting my muscles that created an increase too much increase in body pressure. And when I say too much, it was an unnecessary amount for what I was doing. And so the only place for my organs to go based on how I was pressurizing my system was down. So what we can do there in both cases, whether it was an injury or if it was an injury and you're someone like me, we have to control the internal body pressures. Now, I mentioned the boat analogy, like a boat being anchored to docks. Well, imagine if that boat was anchored to docks with no water under it. That is equivalent to, with no water, a boat with no water but anchored is equivalent to like a pelvic floor that's on vacation. It's excessively stretched. It's just not, it's not, it's not doing its job for whatever reason. So over time, those anchors are going to get dry rotted and weak, and they could give in. That is one of the underlying or the natural history of prolapse when the pelvic floor muscles aren't doing their job, when the connective tissue's intact. Now, let's say the pelvic floor, the water is underneath the boat, the anchors are intact, and we're all good. You're going to be a lot better off because you have that water underneath the boat to support the boat in addition to the anchors versus no boat at all, or no water at all. Does that make sense? Now, let's say the boat is sitting in water that's very turbulent, or really you got a huge rain and the water levels are high, so the boat is higher and it's still anchored to the docks, and there's a lot of just wake or waves because of the weather. Well, I want you to think that as excessive amounts of tone within the pelvic floor muscles, whether that is because of improper or unideal bracing strategies like I was doing, or a high level of tissue guarding because of scar tissue or old injuries or other reasons that can be linked somehow to increased unnecessary tone in the pelvic floor. So that can create unnecessary tension through the anchors that are holding that boat onto the docks, and you can have problems there as well, the ropes. And that can create an issue from a pelvic floor perspective. So you may have pain, and that pain could be from the muscles themselves. It can be excessive just tension through the passive tissues that are attached to your bony pelvis. And so you're like, oh, my SI hurts, or I have pain there. And the what we need to do is reduce how turbulent the muscles are. And we have to find out why the turbulence is there in the first place. Is it because the pelvic floor muscles themselves are high tone because of the way you're bracing your core and your abdominals and using your breath? Or is it because there's something else going on, like inflammatory process in your pelvis because of your fertility or your cycle? Or there's something else going on that impacts, like the thyroid hormone that circulates throughout our body. They impact our smooth muscle. It impacts certain things related to our high impact on development, or metabolism rather. And then we have a hormonal system that comes from our brain, goes right to our ovaries, and cells within our ovaries produce estrogen, and then also cells that eventually produce progesterone. And it could be hormonal inflammation if we're living in a constant state of stress, so our cortisol levels are up, and our pelvic floor is the ones that gets the fallout. So I hope that makes sense. Just as a wrap, you can use the pelvic organ prolapse analogy as thinking in a tent. It's not in your tent, but they're in your space. Now, there is a case when it gets so significant that the like the uterus can actually come through the vaginal opening, and that is a uterine prolapse. It is coming through, not poking through the vaginal, like the tissue, but it's coming out of the vagina. But otherwise, the front pressure, like the bladder, is called a cystocele, and then the back is a rectocele. And you could also have combinations of 2 or 3. And as a PT, I can't necessarily diagnose it. I can say vaginal wall descent. It's the front wall and it's up to this point relative to your vagina. And we should be testing this in different positions like standing as well as laying on your back, wherever you're symptomatic, and time of day. Time of day also can matter. Hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have questions, and I will see you on our next video.